Hi guys, I'm Munya and welcome back to Elevate Psychology. We're now at the crucial stage, stage 3, exam preparation. This section of the series is all about developing your ability to sit exams, and that means answering the questions properly, being able to identify and correct your mistakes, and also avoid areas of error that literally thousands of students across the UK have also made. Today I'll be introducing you to the 2 things that will get you the top marks in any exam you ever sit: the exams report and practice papers. One of my favourite game shows as a young whippersnapper was Takeshi's Castle. It was this Japanese game show where thousands of contestants would run through this obstacle course filled with debilitating, potentially life-ending traps. And as much joy as I took from watching these Japanese contestants be permanently crippled, I also noticed that there was a subgroup that would hang back and just watch and witness where all the mistakes were being made, where people were falling into traps before blitzing through the course and winning the prize. And it's the same with exams. Every year students go into the exam room, the same topics come up and the same mistakes get made, rinse and repeat. But this shouldn't be the case, because right under your nose there is a document that tells you every mistake that has ever been made in a psychology exam. It's called the examiner's report, and as you'll know from episode 2, whilst the syllabus tells us where you gain marks, the examiner's report tells us where marks are lost. So let's start to explore how this document could actually be used. Rewind to June 2015. Here's one of the questions that was actually asked in the exam. Psychologists have used case studies to investigate processes such as memory. Outline the strengths and or limitations of using case studies in psychological research. Now that should be easy, right? Identify what a case study is and potentially outline some of the strengths and weaknesses. However, the examiner's report tells us that there was a range of answers on this question, and that means that most students went into the exam room and didn't walk out with all 4 marks on what should have been a fairly straightforward question. Let's start to break it down. On screen you can see some of the key areas of the examiner's report have been highlighted. Firstly, we're told a lot of people don't fully understand reliability and validity as scientific terms, or even what case studies are. Based on this, I know that when I'm preparing for an exam, I need to have a list of key definitions and concepts, otherwise I've got no hope of answering the question. Secondly, the examiner's report tells us that even though examples weren't requested in the question, students who walked out with the top marks were those who used other examples to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of case studies. So just from that short paragraph, I now know that I'm probably going to lose marks if I don't have a clear set of definitions, but I can also gain them by selectively applying examples. 2 things I wouldn't have known unless I read the examiner's report. Let's take a look at another example, this time a 12 marker. Outline and evaluate Bowlby's theory of attachment. Again, fairly straightforward. Outline Bowlby's theory of attachment and then evaluate it. But let's see how loads of students actually lost out on some big time marks. The examiner tells us that most students knew what Bowlby's theory was. Great. But then it tells us that whilst they knew details of other theories, they weren't able to apply them in an evaluative context. This tells me that I should spend some time writing notes on the details of theories, but perhaps spend more time talking about how these theories complement, contrast and criticize one another in an evaluative context, because if I don't, I'm not getting any AO2 marks. I can also see that long waffly answers didn't go down very well with examiners. They only wanted to see a quick snapshot description and a punchy evaluative analysis. Once again, we see that by not reading the examiner's report, we don't know about these mistakes and therefore we're just as likely to make them. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, yeah, those are simple mistakes, I definitely wouldn't make them. Guess what? Everyone's thinking that. We have something called a self-protecting bias, which makes us believe we are the exception to the rule, whereas as we proved, we're just as likely as making the same errors. Don't skip the opportunity to see where other students went wrong. Find the exam's report, download it, compare it with your notes, and make sure you grill yourself to make sure the same mistakes aren't there. Let's move on to the second major key, and something we'll be spending the next few episodes on: practice papers. Now here's a thought. In almost everything, people acknowledge that practice makes perfect. It could be anything: acting, sport, gaming, music. We tend to find that the best people in those fields are the ones who practice most. But what's interesting is that as soon as we get to exams, that logic grinds to a halt. Imagine the absolute global outcry if on the start line of the 100-meter finals race, some overweight guy in greasy lycra shorts with a donut kebab in one hand and chicken nuggets in the other hand waltzes up to the start line bragging that he only started practicing the night before. It just wouldn't happen. It would be global outcry, and yet when it comes to exams, that's exactly what we're doing. When we sit down and ask students how many practice papers they've actually done, the answer tends to be little to none, meaning that the first exam they ever see is the one that counts the most. All of a sudden, MC Chicken Nuggets isn't in the minority after all. Practice papers are free. You can download them 24/7, and they are the closest thing you will get to an exam because they are exams. However, because they're so similar, that usually means two things. Number one, they take a long time to do, and number two, it's easy to feel overwhelmed if you haven't fully grasped your notes yet. So I'm going to introduce you to something called the CH formula. 4 words beginning with CH that I used to do a lot of practice papers in a short space of time. The first CH is the word chunks. You don't have to sit down and do entire practice papers. If you don't have 2 hours, how about 15 to 20 minutes? Now that might not sound like a lot, but over the course of a week, we're talking about 2 hours of practice papers. Multiply that across the months, and we're talking about dozens of hours of practice papers. Practice papers are the strongest correlate to the best grades. The more you do, the better you perform. The second CH is the word cheat. Now, before you start having minor heart palpitations at the prospect of violating every moral code you've ever stood for, relax. What I'm talking about is using your notes, having them in front of you. Why? Because one of the reasons people don't do practice papers is because they don't fully know their notes. When will they fully know their notes? The night before the exam. The sooner you have your notes out in front of you, the sooner you can get cracking on practice papers. The third CH is to check. Doing a lot of something is one thing, but doing it right is a completely different matter. Have you ever watched meatheads doing a press-up competition? There's one guy who's savouring every meticulous press-up, and then another guy who's straight banging his pelvis into the floor, screaming, 1001, 1002. Getting practice papers checked by teachers is crucial. Otherwise, you're training yourself to become better at making mistakes. With every practice paper you do, isolate the areas you made mistakes. Redo those small areas until you are word perfect. Some students even use what's called a bulletproof booklet, a little document containing all the questions they've ever got wrong and the correct answer to those questions. You'll find a copy of the bulletproof booklet in your introductory welcome pack that we emailed to you when you signed up. Finally, the last CH is challenge. Once you've got into the rhythm of practice papers and you've nailed your technique, now it's time to add a bit of pressure. This means closing your notes, setting a timer, and working in silence to the allocated time. Replicating these stressful exam conditions means desensitizing yourself to them, meaning on the day of your exam, it won't feel like an unfamiliar alien situation, but instead just another day of practice papers. So the first action point for this episode is to calculate how long it is until your exams. Then set yourself a target of how many practice papers you'll do before that time. Remember, work in chunks. The next action point is to print them off and start working through them. Don't forget to get them checked, isolate your mistakes, and put them into the bulletproof booklet. We're going to go through some actual practice papers in the following episodes, so make sure you check them out. But for now, I've been Munya.